The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, and banners flew. Yet one man stood unnoticed in the back, a faded marine jacket on his shoulders, an old truck parked just outside, and a folded note from a son who asked him to sit in the front row. But the world doesn't always recognize quiet sacrifice until it's forced to. This is the story of Walt Harrison, a father, a forgotten veteran, and the moment six silent warriors rose in unison, not for applause, but for honor. What unfolded next wasn't just about a seat at graduation. It was a reminder that dignity never ages, and respect, when it finally arrives, can shake a room into silence. Sometimes the most powerful salute comes not from a stage, but from a son who knew when to stand. You won't forget this. The auditorium pulsed with energy, cheers erupting, phones lifted high to catch the moment, banners fluttering above proud faces. Parents laughed, siblings waved, and the air vibrated with the joy of accomplishment. But at the far end of the room, tucked away in the shadows, stood a man alone. Walt Harrison, draped in a faded Marine Corps jacket stretched over time-worn jeans, clutched a folded piece of paper in his hand, a handwritten invitation. His boots, scuffed and worn at the heels, echoed lightly as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the front rows. His eyes swept across the sea of families, searching. Before he could reach the designated section, a woman in a sleek black dress and headset stepped in front of him, halting his approach. "This area is for family only," she said, scanning him briefly, eyes pausing on the seams of his old coat. Walt's voice was low but firm. "I am family. My son's graduating." She didn't bother to check the list. "I'm going to need you to step back, sir, or security will escort you out." Before he could reply, two security guards began making their way over. Walt didn't raise his voice, didn't protest. He simply nodded once, as if to himself, and backed away into the quiet margins of the room. The crowd was too focused on the ceremony to notice the confrontation. But six men seated in the fifth row did. Veterans, silent, sharp-eyed, watched Walt return to the shadows. He carried himself not with defeat, but with dignity. He hadn't come to cause trouble. Men like Walt didn't have to raise their voices. They stood tall and steady until someone else stood up beside them. Walt Harrison had driven more than 900 miles in a rust-speckled Ford F-150, a truck held together by memory more than machinery. The dashboard rattled, and the passenger seat was lined with old receipts, paper maps, and oil-stained rags. He had slept in that seat the night before, slouched upright beneath a thin blanket, the folded invitation tucked carefully inside the glove compartment. He was 68 now. His body ached in ways he didn't speak of. His knees were stiff in the morning, his hearing diminished by years of explosions and gunfire. The world moved too fast now, spinning forward while he remained steady and still. But none of that mattered on this day. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here for Caleb. His son, the first in their family to graduate college, had sent that invitation in his own handwriting. It wasn't elaborate, bound, just a simple card, but the words had burrowed deep into Walt's chest. "Dad, I want you in the front row." That line alone nearly broke him. Walt wasn't one to cry. He wasn't one for hugs or soft conversations. Emotions were things he carried silently, like all the rest. But those words, so plain, so few, had gripped him harder than any battlefield ever had. He hadn't seen Caleb face to face in over a year. Their conversations were short, matter of fact. But Walt never missed a Sunday call. That was his way of saying, "I'm still here. I'm proud of you." And now, as dawn bloomed softly across the college campus, he stood in the parking lot brushing dust from his jeans, straightening the collar of that jacket patched at the elbows. It was more than clothing. It was the last relic of the man he used to be, the life he once lived. He wasn't coming to impress anyone. He only wanted a seat, any seat, close enough to watch his son walk across that stage. That would be enough. That had to be enough. He arrived early, long before the doors opened. Promptness had been ingrained in him long ago. You didn't show up late for a mission. And this was more important than any mission he'd ever been assigned. Parking at the far end of the lot, he carefully checked the invitation once more, slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and began the slow walk toward the building. There was no urgency in his steps, only purpose. His presence wasn't loud, but it was unwavering. Families flooded the courtyard outside the auditorium. Some came dressed like they were walking into a fashion show. Shiny shoes, sleek suits, handbags that gleamed under the sun. Walt looked nothing like them. The lines on his face told stories no degree could rival. His jacket, frayed at the cuffs and faded at the seams, had survived jungles, monsoons, and war zones. A small tear near the shoulder had been stitched up by his own hand. His blue shirt was clean, his jeans freshly laundered, but nothing he wore was new. His boots, though polished, had marched through memories too heavy for most to carry. Inside, rows of chairs were cordoned off with satin ropes. Small printed signs marked them. Reserved for family of honor graduates. That's where Caleb had told him to sit. Walt approached quietly, stepping along the side aisle with care, his hand holding the invitation like it was more fragile than paper. He reached the edge of the reserved section. A woman, young and efficient in black, glanced up from her clipboard. "My son asked me to sit up front," Walt said softly, offering her the card. She barely looked at it. Her eyes went to his jacket, then his boots. "This section is for immediate family of honor students," she replied, her tone clipped. "Indifferent? I am his family. I'm but his father. No badge, no pass." "I have this," he said, lifting the folded note. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to step aside." Walt paused. He didn't know whether to insist or step back. His silence was filled with something deeper than hesitation. He had faced worse than this. But still, it hurt. The woman turned slightly and whispered something into her headset. Moments later, two campus security officers began walking down the aisle, not in a rush, but with enough presence to make their point clear. And still, no one else in the auditorium noticed, except those 6 men in the 5th row. As the men in dark suits began walking toward Walt, their eyes locked on him. Not a single word was exchanged. Silence rippled outward from their presence like a slow tide. The people seated nearby kept their heads turned, eyes fixed on their own business, careful not to let curiosity get the best of them. A few parents threw cautious glances, only to retreat back into their polite small talk and stifled laughter. Some nervously adjusted their ties. Others stared down at the folded programs in their laps. To them, he was nothing but an odd figure out of place, a forgotten relic seated in the wrong row, wearing memories no one had asked to see. A silent, stooped man draped in a jacket that spoke of a history too heavy for this kind of bright, breezy afternoon. Walt stood quietly near the aisle, his eyes searching the sea of unfamiliar faces for just one that might offer comfort or recognition. But everything around him blurred. The clapping, the chatter, the proud families snapping pictures and fixing flower corsages. None of it seemed real. To Walt, it faded like fog pulling back from a shoreline. In its place rose the suffocating heat of the Vietnamese jungle. Suddenly, he wasn't 74, standing awkwardly in a school auditorium. He was 22 again, his boots sinking into wet soil, mud caked on his face, sweat pouring down his back under camo fatigues. His hands gripped an M16 like it was an extension of his own body. The ambush had come fast. The sharp crack of gunfire sliced through the trees like lightning tearing across a night sky. Chaos exploded. Men yelled, some didn't get the chance to again. Beside him, Simmons went down hard, bleeding and unable to move. Walt didn't think. He just acted. He slung Simmons over his shoulder and ran, dodging through thick brush and gunfire, every muscle screaming under the weight of another grown man. Somehow they made it out, just barely. Walt earned one of his 3 Bronze Stars for that act alone. The second came after leading a counterattack against a fortified enemy position while his unit was badly outnumbered. The third, well, he never talked about that one. Not with anyone, and probably never would. 2 Purple Hearts. Shrapnel still lodged in his leg. The kind of pain that showed up without warning in the middle of the night and reminded him what he'd survived. But if anyone asked, Walt would simply offer a modest shrug and say, "I came home, that's what matters." And yet, even he knew that coming home didn't mean the war was over. It had just changed uniforms. There were no parades when he stepped off the bus, no signs, no handshakes, no one waiting with tears or thanks. One day he was a Marine Scout sniper. The next, a warehouse worker on the graveyard shift loading trucks. then construction, then cleaning boilers for the school district. No one ever asked what he'd been through, and Walt didn't offer. That was the silent code of his generation. Carry your pain alone and keep walking. The medals stayed in a drawer, the uniform folded and buried in the back of a closet. Life moved on, and the world didn't look back. He never wanted applause. But every now and then, like today, when he stepped into a room like this and caught the way people glanced, hesitated, then quickly turned away, it hit him deeper than any bullet ever had. That patched jacket, meant to honor services, too often inspired discomfort or suspicion. And for men like Walt, the harsh truth lingered like a bruise. They had survived one war only to return to a country that no longer saw them, that had forgotten how. Around him, the graduation continued with polite clamor. Families leaned in for photos, faculty adjusted their gowns, ushers pointed people to their seats like it was any other occasion. For most it was, but not for everyone. In the middle rows toward the center sat 6 men dressed in sleek suits. They didn't stand out. That was the point. Neat haircuts, conservative ties, calm, unreadable faces. If you passed them, you might assume they were senior executives or perhaps retired agents. Nothing flashy, no attention drawn, but their eyes stayed fixed on Walt. They had noticed him the moment he arrived. His gait, his still alert posture, the way he scanned the room, not out of anxiety, but assessment. It wasn't the patches on his jacket that gave him away. It was how he carried himself. The quiet watchfulness of someone who had lived through things most people couldn't imagine. Among the 6 was Commander Blake Rohr, former Navy SEAL team leader turned federal security consultant. He had seen action in Afghanistan, Iraq, and places never named in newspapers. Rohr had spent years analyzing old operations, studying missions that never made headlines. He leaned subtly to the man beside him and muttered under his breath, "That's Harrison. Walt Harrison, 3rd Recon, Vietnam." The rest turned, eyes narrowing with understanding. They knew the name. They'd heard the stories. "He's the one who dragged Simmons and Carrillo out of that kill zone," one said quietly. "Held off an ambush with only 7 rounds and a busted radio," added another. A third nodded, then disappeared after 75. No interviews, no memoirs, just vanished. Again, they looked at Walt, still as a statue, quietly holding a folded note from his son. Whether he sensed their attention or ignored it completely, no one could tell. To the casual observer, he looked misplaced. An elderly man out of sync with the polished surroundings, too close to the VIP section. But to these men, he looked like what he truly was. A warrior who didn't need fanfare to prove his worth. A legend who had never tried to be one. None of the 6 moved. They didn't speak again. But something in the air around them shifted. The quiet that had filled row 6 was no longer passive. It was alert, charged with silent recognition. Because they all knew from their own years in the field, when a man like Walt Harrison is dismissed or overlooked in public, the silence around him never lasts. And sometimes silence is the loudest signal of all. The murmur started soft, barely there, whispers brushing through the crowd like the first stirrings of wind before a storm. Through the rustle of trees, most might have missed the subtle shifts in energy, but not Walt. He had long mastered the art of reading a room before words ever filled it. Tension to him was a living thing. It crackled in the air, whispered in footsteps. Before he saw them, he heard the sharp, deliberate click of polished shoes. 2 security officers emerged, one younger, stiff with protocol, the other older, more seasoned, his badge clipped squarely on his belt. They moved with the muted precision of men trained to handle things quietly, discreetly. But Walt wasn't new to this sort of dance. He knew that voice before it even spoke, polished, professional, and sterile. "Sir," the younger one began, measured and polite. "There have been a few concerns. We just need to confirm your identity. Would you mind stepping outside with us for a moment?" Walt didn't budge. His feet were planted, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded letter. His fingers, thick, scarred, bearing the history of work and war, unfolded the paper with slow, deliberate care. "My son wrote this," he said softly, eyes steady. "Said he wanted me in the front row." His words, not mine. The guard gave it a cursory glance and nodded mechanically. I understand, sir, but this isn't an official ticket. We're still going to have to ask you to move. Walt met their eyes, not challenging, just calm. Then he folded the letter and placed it back into his jacket. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, his voice low but unwavering. I just came to see my boy walk that stage, that's all. The younger officer stepped forward, a hand casually resting near his belt, not yet threatening, but ready. Sir, I'm going to ask you again. And then it happened. The shrill scrape of a chair leg dragged abruptly across the auditorium floor, sharp as a shot. The noise echoed through the space, and every head turned toward it. From the sixth row, a man in a dark suit stood, then another, until six men were standing, together, motionless, wordless. There was no panic in their movements, no grand theatrics, just deliberate unity. They stood with the same quiet coordination that once cleared corners and breached doors in hostile lands. Slowly, each man reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small, gleaming object, a gold trident pin. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. They simply held the pins at chest height, letting the light catch the gold. The room stilled, the whispers faded, and for the first time, the crowd really looked. Not at Walt's weathered clothes, not at the deep lines on his face, but at him, at who he was. One of the men, tall and lean with a hawk-like intensity in his gaze, stepped into the aisle. His steps were slow but certain as he approached the security officers and Walt. Then he spoke, his voice not raised but steady, like a man used to being listened to. That man, he said, is the reason I'm alive. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of weight, of respect, of questions unasked. The guards froze, suddenly unsure, not just because of the tridents, but because of the truth that filled the air. For once, Walt wasn't just a man in worn boots and a faded coat. He was something more, and everyone in the room felt it. One of the guards opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The other lowered his hand from his belt, his posture softening. They both stepped back slightly, instinctively recognizing that whatever authority they thought they held had just shifted. Up on the stage, the dean faltered mid-sentence, his practiced speech crumbling as he glanced toward the disruption. We are honored today by some distinguished guests, he stammered, his eyes scanning the crowd, unable to process what exactly was unfolding. Then another voice rose, clear, young, slightly cracked from emotion, but unyielding. That man is my father. Every head turned again. On stage, among the sea of graduating students in black caps and gowns, stood David Harrison, 22. Honor stole across his shoulders, diploma not yet in hand. He had stepped away from the line, gripping the microphone. His face was flushed, but his spine was straight. If he leaves, David said, each word crisp, then I leave too. It hit the room like a strike of lightning. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. David stepped down from the stage. Slowly, deliberately, every step watched by hundreds, every eye fixed on the bond between father and son. When he reached Walt, David didn't hesitate. He stopped, straightened, then lifted his hand in a formal salute. It was sharp, clean, honoring. Walt blinked. He didn't speak. But deep inside, something shifted. He had only hoped for a glimpse of his son from a distance, a back seat, a moment in the shadows. He never expected this, never imagined this kind of public acknowledgement, not this quiet, powerful reverence. Behind them, the six men, SEALs clearly, moved into a subtle formation. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind Walt and David like sentinels, a human monument to memory and loyalty. No one clapped. Not yet. The audience seemed to understand that something sacred was unfolding, something unplanned and pure. A son, a father, a story long unseen finally being honored in the daylight. Oh, sure saw him. And for the first time that day, every eye in the auditorium looked exactly where it belonged. The hush in the air wasn't just silence, it was reverence, and then the murmurs began to swell. Who is he? Did he really serve? What did he do to make those men stand for him? People leaned toward one another, trying to piece it together. A forgotten history. A man who had given much and now, finally, received the one thing he'd never asked for but always deserved. Recognition. The name Seal Trident drifted through the auditorium like a reverent whisper. One of those rare, almost mythical phrases passed down in fragments, spoken in low tones by fathers or uncles who had once worn the uniform. Most in the room didn't fully understand it. Not really, but they sensed its weight. And that was enough to make them stop talking, stop moving, and simply watch, because something sacred was happening, and deep down they knew better than to interrupt. Near the front, seated among polished faculty members and stoic dignitaries, an elderly man slowly rose from his seat. Though age had claimed much of him, his posture remained upright, his spine unbent by time. A row of ribbons across his chest told the story of decades. Decades of service, of command, of sacrifice. A retired general, silent until now. He didn't utter a word. He didn't raise his voice or attempt to draw eyes. Instead, he brought his hand to his heart and gave a single unwavering nod, directed straight at Walt. It wasn't for show. It was something deeper. One warrior recognizing another. That solitary act rippled through the air like a quiet wave. A woman near the aisle dabbed at her eye, blinking away tears before they could fall. A father sitting stiffly in his seat, program balanced on his knees, straightened with quiet pride. At the back of the room, a cluster of students who had been halfway through scrolling or recording slowly lowered their phones. And then, from somewhere in the room, a clap. Just one. Soft, measured, but not polite, not the kind offered out of obligation. This clap had weight behind it, each beat deliberate, almost heavy. Then came another, and another. Row by row it began, not with excitement or noise, but with reverence. A wave of hands meeting palms, not to celebrate, but to honor. Walt didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't even glance around. He stood quietly beside his son, hands folded in front of him the way he had stood so many times before. At funerals, at departures, at flag ceremonies that marked endings and beginnings. The applause swelled, not louder but deeper, filling the room not with sound, but with understanding. The recognition came late, but it came. This wasn't applause for a name in a program or a young man in a gown. This was for something the crowd had almost overlooked. It was for a man who had once bled for their right to gather here. A man who had almost been turned away, made to feel like a stranger. The usher who had blocked him earlier now stood off to the side, her clipboard hugged tightly to her chest like a shield. She didn't lift her eyes. She didn't speak. She simply stood still, as if realizing the weight of the moment she'd misjudged. No one in that auditorium was clapping for a seat anymore. They were clapping for presence, for a quiet dignity that needed no announcement. Walt didn't speak, didn't need to. He simply returned the general's nod, because for men like them, words were often the least important thing. He turned slightly to his son, David, whose eyes shimmered with unshed emotion, locked in a moment of silent understanding. David, who had stepped down from the stage in the middle of his own moment to stand beside his father. That act, deliberate and brave, meant more than any medal Walt had ever been pinned. Walt placed his hand gently on David's shoulder. His voice, when it came, was low and barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of everything that had been left unspoken for years. "I only came to see you walk that stage." David looked at him, his jaw clenched tight, his throat working to swallow emotion. He nodded once, sharp and certain, then turned slightly, guiding his father forward, toward the path that had just recently been denied them. No one stopped them now. No objections, no barriers. Not because someone had announced it, but because the room itself had shifted. Every step Walt took was met not with awkward glances, but with a respectful hush, an acknowledgement of something unspoken, but deeply understood. The same usher who had dismissed him earlier now stood off to the side, still clutching her clipboard. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't offer an apology. She simply stepped back, her eyes downcast. Walt didn't look her way. He didn't have to. He wasn't walking forward out of pride or to prove a point. He walked because his son was leading him now. When they reached the front row, David motioned toward the empty seat reserved for distinguished guests. Family seats that were not to be taken lightly. But no one said a word. No one dared challenge it. Walt lowered himself slowly into the chair, his old joints creaking in protest, the worn fabric of his jacket brushing against crisp suits on either side. Those who had earlier looked past him now sat silent, not in discomfort, but in humility. Behind them, 6 men stood in quiet formation, the SEALs. Broad-shouldered, still, and solemn, arms folded or hanging at their sides. They didn't take seats. They didn't speak. They stood like sentinels, guardians not only of Walt, but of what he represented. A legacy, a truth. There were no speeches, no formal apologies, no grand acknowledgments. And yet, everything had changed. This moment was no longer about dress codes or assigned seating. It was about presence, about respect earned not through demands or titles, but through action and silence. Walt had never come for praise. He didn't care for recognition. All he wanted was to witness his son's milestone. But in asking for nothing, he received the one thing so many crave their entire lives: respect. When the final name echoed through the auditorium and the last cap soared into the air, the room erupted in cheers. Joyful noise, laughter, and the pop of cameras filled the space. But even in the celebration, something lingered in the front rows, a quiet grace that hadn't left. Walt remained seated, hands resting calmly on his knees. He didn't rush. He didn't move. For the first time in what felt like a long time, he wasn't expected to be anywhere else. He had seen his son walk the stage. That was more than enough. She didn't approach with pity, not with curiosity either. What she brought was something harder to find these days: genuine reverence. A young mother holding her child close stepped forward and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile with emotion, "for raising him and for everything else." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Her words carried the weight of generations, spoken not out of obligation, but from the heart. Nearby, a teenage boy stepped forward, wearing a rock cap clearly too big for him, probably his older brother's. He offered a handshake. "My granddad served in Nam too," he said. "He would have wanted to meet you." Even the usher, yes, the same one who had dismissed Walt with that look earlier, stood silently off to the side now, shame tugging at his features. He didn't say anything, didn't try to make amends. Walt didn't return the look, not out of bitterness. He simply had no need to. Some things resolved themselves without confrontation. Then they came, the SEALs. 6 men, all carrying themselves with quiet authority, gathered around him in a loose semicircle. They didn't rush him, didn't wrap him in clumsy embraces or make a scene. They stood there, hands behind their backs or resting calmly at their sides, a quiet tribute from soldiers who understood the language of silence. The tallest among them stepped forward. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a small, worn object, round, metallic, dulled by time. He placed it gently in Walt's open palm. It was a challenge coin, etched with the insignia of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, Walt's unit. On the back in Latin, Semper Vigilans, always vigilant. Walt stared at it for a moment that stretched longer than a breath, the past flashing in glimpses only he could see. Then slowly, deliberately, he closed his fingers around it. "We don't salute many men anymore," the SEAL said, his voice firm but respectful. "But we stood because we remembered." The others nodded, no words needed. Walt didn't speak, couldn't. His throat was too tight, heart too full. But he gave a small nod and turned his eyes to his son, who stood just beyond the circle, watching it all with quiet pride. The applause had long faded. The crowd was dispersing. The ceremony was over. But in that still, sacred moment between men bonded by sacrifice and time, something more enduring than honor or respect was exchanged. Legacy. By the time Walt made it back to the parking lot, the last of the chairs were being folded away. Shadows had grown longer, stretched across the asphalt like memories refusing to fade. The sun dipped low, golden light brushing across the tops of parked cars. Walt opened the creaky door of his old Ford. The seat springs groaned beneath him, the leather cracked, worn smooth from decades of silent miles. But this truck, it was his. It knew him. And here he could just be. He didn't turn the key. Instead, he sat, one hand resting on the wheel, the other gently rolling the coin in his palm. It had grown warm from his grip. The edges were softened, but the symbol still held strong. Third Recon, always vigilant. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a folded invitation, the one he'd carried all the way from home. His son's handwriting, just slightly off center, a little messy, but full of intention. Dad, I want you in the front row. He read the words again, like they were etched in stone, not just for what they said, but for what they nearly hadn't been. How close he had come to missing the moment entirely. Not because he was running late, not because he wasn't welcome, but because men like him, quiet men who had long since hung up the uniform, aren't always seen the way they should be anymore. He thought of how many had stood like he once did, in the shadows of crowded rooms, in lobbies, in the back rows, unnoticed. Not because they lacked valor, but because time had dulled their appearance. Their ribbons faded, their uniforms threadbare, their voices too weary to remind the world what they had once endured. He wasn't bitter. That wasn't who he was. But he did wonder how many like him were still being quietly overlooked. How many had no one standing up for them? Outside, life carried on. Laughter bubbled up from scattered corners of the parking lot. Families posed for photos. Students held flowers. Joy filled the air like sunlight. But inside that old truck, something far more enduring rested gently in a calloused hand. A legacy. Not wrapped in medals or pinned on uniforms, but living in a son who had stood when it counted most. Walt allowed himself a small smile, just once, because sometimes the highest honor isn't in receiving a salute. It's in knowing you raised someone strong enough to offer one when your own hands are too tired to lift. Some fathers raise warriors. Others are warriors who raise sons willing to carry the torch when their fathers no longer can. There's something deeply moving about a man who never asks for praise, who simply serves, sacrifices, and expects nothing in return. Walt Harrison was one of those men. And the truth is, this country is filled with them. Fathers, veterans, neighbors, men and women who gave quietly, returned humbly, and live each day in the backdrop of a world too quick to forget how to say thank you. This story isn't just about a graduation. It's about how we see how we young and how often we don't. In a time when loudness is mistaken for strength and appearance for worth, stories like Walt's remind us of something far deeper. That true dignity doesn't demand a spotlight. It earns its place in silence. So now ask yourself, how many Walt Harrisons have passed through your life? The quiet janitor, the elderly neighbor who never speaks of the war, the man in the back of the auditorium not asking to be seen, just hoping not to be dismissed. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we start looking a little closer. Maybe it's just an old jacket now, faded, worn down at the seams, its patches barely legible. Most people don't even notice it anymore. But maybe it's time we started noticing again. Have you ever known someone like Walt? Someone who gave everything they had, their strength, their youth, their heart, and never asked for a single thing in return? Someone who carried the weight of sacrifice with quiet dignity, never needing applause, never looking for recognition? If you have, say their name. Write it in the comments. Tell the world what they meant to you, how they changed your life without ever asking for credit. And if Walt's story touched something inside you, made you pause, made you wonder about that quiet stranger you passed today, give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs to remember that not all heroes wear uniforms we recognize. Some simply wear silence and carry memories that don't belong on display. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about the kind of courage that doesn't demand attention, the kind of kindness that doesn't need to be loud. Because often the deepest form of respect is the one no one has to ask for. And next time you're standing at a ceremony, waiting at a bus stop, or sitting in a quiet diner, look again right now. Look twice. That man sipping his coffee alone, head slightly bowed, he just might be the reason you still get to stand.